Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis, your co-host for the Pagan World Congress, and I'm very pleased to be taking part in hosting this wonderful event. I hope that you're enjoying it. We have had many fascinating speakers and have many more to come. Tonight, I'm going to speak to you again, and as you may remember, last night, I spoke to you about community-wide projects that I have seen in the course of my career that were successful and why they were successful. And also ways in which we sometimes sabotage ourselves unconsciously in pursuing community-wide projects. I'm not going to say anything more about that tonight because I've already said what I had to say about that. Tonight, I want to talk about the practical things that I think we can do to move forward on our common issues. Again, my focus these days is on common issues and common actions. And, our audience for this Congress are all over the world. They come from many different backgrounds. They're not all going to have exactly the same common interests, nor will the same common actions be perfect for everyone. So tonight I'm going to be talking really from my own point of view. Similarly, we have people taking part in this Congress from many nations around the world. In many ways, what I'm going to say tonight is dictated by where I am in the United States. But I do feel that all over the world, we're seeing many of the same forces, many of the same situations. And I do think that while what I'm saying is local to my place, it also has a metaversal quality for everyone. And that, of course, is the subject of my talk tonight, thinking metaversally and acting locally. And what do I mean by that? When I say think metaversally, what I mean is thinking above the box, not just outside it, but above it. It's very important that we watch what's happening locally, nationally, and internationally, but it's also very important that we don't just observe this, but that we also try to understand what's happening, that we analyze it, that we try to see the reasons behind the actions that we are watching take place. And those reasons are not always immediately obvious. So often I hear people say, such and such politician that I don't like is just stupid, or they don't know what they're doing. I have to tell you, and please trust me on this, that no one who's in a position of influence in the world got there by being stupid or by not knowing what they're doing. It may not be obvious what they're doing, but they know what they're doing. And sometimes taking the time to figure out what they're doing will answer an awful lot of questions that on the surface do not appear to make sense. One of the subjects that I have spoken about extensively in the last couple of years is Project 2025. And again, on one level, this has to do very much with the United States, but it also really has international implications as well. If you're not familiar with Project 2025, it is basically the published plan of the Christian dominionist / Christian nationalist movement for transforming this country. And a lot of people are now familiar with Project 2025, but not necessarily in detail. A lot of people have a very surface understanding of it because it's gigantic. And a lot of what's happening doesn't make a lot of sense to them because they're not actually familiar with the goals of this project, the goals of the Christian dominionist movement. A lot of people make the assumption that the goal is to establish a highly centralized Nazi-style Christian theocracy. But if you look closely at what they've said, that isn't certainly the entirety of what they're trying to do. If that were what they were trying to do, a lot of what they're doing doesn't make any sense. But in reality, a good deal of that plan is actually dedicated not at building a highly centralized administration, but at destroying a highly centralized administration, removing centralized resources and forcing things back onto a more local level, because they know that in many areas, they have a lock on power now, except for national oversight. If they can get rid of that national oversight, their hands will be untied in those areas. There are other areas, of course, where this will not be true, but they're playing a long game. They figure they will get those in time. So what you're seeing happening is not so much the takeover that it in part appears to be, so much as a dismantling. It's not stupid. It's not unintentional. It's very intentional. And why would they be doing this? One of the reasons is because for most of the last several generations, people in the United States in times of crisis have looked to government projects for relief of various kinds in natural disasters, in economic troubles, in terms of our daily lives in many ways. Before the last few generations, those things generally were not available, and people looked instead to local churches. One of the big aspects of Project 2025 is to return a lot of that power to those local conservative Christian churches. If you cannot get food assistance from your government, where are you going to go? You're almost certainly going to have to go to a church, and it's almost certainly, for our people, at present, not going to be one of ours. If you are in need of help after a natural disaster, where are you going to go? Their hope is that you will go to the conservative Christians that back them, because this will give them greater power. This will give them much greater social control. This is why they're dismantling so much of the central infrastructure of this country. This is what I mean by thinking metaversally, not just looking at what's happening, but asking, who does this serve? What is this doing? And not making the assumption that is being motivated by raw emotion or a lack of thought, but understanding that no, there's thought there, just might not be immediately obvious to you. When you understand what they're trying to do, what they're doing is really very insidious. It's certainly not foolish in any sense. It's something we very much must be aware of. It's important to look at everything that we're seeing in this way, not just look at the surface. Look at what are the reasons that people are taking these actions. My altar sister, Lady Bitterwind, who was one of my great teachers in life, used to have a song that she was very fond of. And it included the line, ask yourself, who does this serve? And if the answer isn't you, well, then that's not good. I don't remember the exact line, but that was the sentiment. But everything that you see happening in society is serving someone, is serving some purpose. None of it is happening merely by chance. And so in observing these things, we need to try to be very clear in understanding what people are trying to do. We also need to be clear in what we are trying to do, in what our goals are and what our directions are. When I say that we need to think metaversally, this is what I mean. Now, there are many things that we can do on national and international levels to affect this situation. But I think that it's also very, very important that we focus our actions locally as well. We can involve ourselves in national and international political activism, voter registration, email and letter writing campaigns, things like this. Those certainly are very valuable. But it's also very important that we look closer to home for our actions, especially because many of us can do far more locally than we can do nationally. Some years ago, my good friend and mentor, Pete Pathfinder, told me a story about the foundation of the Aquarian Tabernacle Church's headquarters in Index, Washington. I have never forgotten that story. In fact, I've never forgotten a lot of stories Pete taught me. What Pete told me in that story was that when he first came to Index, Washington, he knew the first thing he needed to do was go out and introduce himself to his new neighbors. And he did that. But he did not go from door to door saying, "Hello, I'm Pete Pathfinder. I'm a witch, and I head the pagan church up the road." No, he went and introduced himself as Pete, your new neighbor, and talked about himself as a person. Look for things they had in common. Let them get to know him first before they found out about the Aquarian Tabernacle Church. The result of this is that when they did find out about the church, they said, "Oh, well, that's just Pete. We already know Pete." And it made everything so much easier. This is an example of working locally. Also, touching on the Aquarian Tabernacle, several years ago I received an oracle from the goddess Demeter through the person of the Aquarian archpriestess Belladonna Laveau. This oracle emphasized the importance of finding local sources for food. Now, this was an oracle that I received privately on at least 2 occasions, but it was also a very public oracle that was given many times in many places. And at the time, it didn't really make all that much sense. The idea that in this country we would have any sort of food insecurity was almost inconceivable several years ago. As we look at the rising price of groceries, as we look at the dissolving trade routes internationally, it's not so odd now. When we look at our local community, being in touch with people is very important. Knowing our neighbors, being known is very important. And again, how do we do that? First, as people. Let them know who you are before you let them know what you are. And use language they will understand. Yes, we're all very special, but we're also just ordinary people too. Very often, we want to emphasize what makes us different, and that's perfectly fine in many circumstances. But it's also good sometimes to emphasize what makes us just the same as everybody else, particularly when we're trying to be on good terms with everybody else. As we look at the potential collapse of national resources, of international trade routes, we really need to consider things like food security. As I say, several years ago, when that oracle was being given, it didn't seem like anything we would ever need to be concerned about. But sometimes the gods see the future more clearly than we do. Today, It seems very, very relevant. And how, on a local level, can we impact that? Well, there are several ways. Um, we can act locally in a number of ways to increase our food security. One is by planting a garden of our own and producing, to some extent, our own food and meeting other people who do the same. It can be a garden in our yard if we have one. It can be on our back porch if we don't have a yard. Um, it can be in small potted plants on some occasions, depending what it is you're trying to grow. But there are things we can do to help stabilize our food security, stocking up on items for the future at a time when prices are rising drastically is a very good idea. At a time when we're not sure what trade is going to be in 6 months, it's not a bad idea. I can remember back during Y2K thinking that all the people stockpiling food were being rather silly. But I don't necessarily think it's silly now. I think that we need to be mindful of this sort of thing. And this is something that we can do locally for ourselves to increase our independence, to increase our ability to stand on our own. Another very important thing is to find the local sources of food. And almost everywhere in the United States, there are local sources of food. There are local farmers, there are farmers markets. And they're quite happy to have customers. And even if the prices at the store keep going up, chances are the local prices may not. Even if our trade network is not as good tomorrow as it was yesterday, those local people will still be there. We can also look at things like community gardens, not just gardens we plant ourselves, but gardens we join with other people to plant, particularly also urban gardens. We don't have to be living in the countryside to take a hand in producing our own food. And we really need to be looking at this at this time. This is one of the ways we can act locally to build our own security. One of the common actions we can take for the common issue that many of us may find ourselves facing. There are many other things that we can do locally as well to prepare for uncertain times. One of them is establishing food pantries. I talked about stocking up food for ourselves, but we can also stock it up for our community. We can do that now before it's a more difficult time. It's a little late to be before it's difficult at all, but we can do it now, and we can have supplies ready if things become worse. There are always people who will benefit from it. We can have food pantries for our own community, so if they don't have to go begging to conservative Christian churches if food does become an issue. We can also do things like thrift stores, because food is not the only thing people need. They need clothing, they need housewares. We can establish our own thrift stores to help our people to survive economic difficulties, which, in my opinion, we certainly appear to be heading towards. But we need to do this now. We need not to wait until, as the Rothschilds used to say, the blood is running in the street. We need to do it now while we have some time to put things together so that we are prepared. Because once that Project 2025 is moving still faster than it's moving now, and it's moved way faster than I think anyone expected, a lot of those trade networks are going to collapse relatively quickly because that's part of the plan. They believe that a depression will, again, force people back into their churches. That's part of their goal. We need to be prepared to survive that. These are some of the things that we can do locally to help with that. to help ourselves survive. Another thing we can do that's very, very important is archiving our materials. We have a great deal of history, and we, who are putting on this Congress, have a huge amount of video history and written history and audio history that we've been directly involved in producing. In the last couple of months, I've been putting up 6 videos a day from our archives and barely gotten through 2 out of 20 years. It's important that we back up these archives in sources that we control. Very often, the way that things are today, people have their videos, their writings, whatever, stored on the cloud, stored on YouTube, stored on Facebook. Any of those things could be shut off tomorrow. We need to make sure that we have maintained copies for our posterity so that we don't run the risk of losing this history. This is another local action we need to be taking, and we need to be recording these things, preserving these things on independent hard drives that we can keep safe locally and in more than one place. Because we have no guarantee that we will not lose those internet resources. Now, I'm not necessarily certain that we will, but we have no guarantee we won't. As we look at the current era, the one thing that we must be certain of is that it's not just going to go back to how it was. It's not really possible. We don't necessarily know where it's going to end up. We know where Project 2025 wants it to end up. And we need to pay some attention to that. If we can prevent that, we certainly should. But we cannot put all of our eggs into the basket of certainty that we will prevent it. We must also prepare for it. And having strong local communities, having strong local resources, being in strong positions in our local communities is the best way we're going to prepare for that. We have many national organizations, and we'll continue to. But national organizations are sometimes very weak locally. And in the end, we are where we are. We live where we live. And so to the extent that we can, we need to pool our resources where we are. We need to focus our efforts where we are. We need to build safety where we are. Now, people out there, some of them are going to say, I'm just fear-mongering. I'm talking about things that will never happen. Couldn't happen in this country. I say that because in the last 20 years, I've talked about this subject several times, as has Ed the Pagan. And that's the response we've normally gotten. I have basically seen people reject this message repeatedly. But I have to point out to you, just last year, as I was talking about the coming of Project 2025, lots of people said, oh no, this can't happen. It's not even real. It's a fantasy. If you don't know it's real now, then you're the one in a fantasy. It's even admitted that they're dealing with it. So what it says has to be taken pretty seriously as being an actual intent that's likely to be followed through on. I wish that I could say something more positive on that subject. But the only positive things I can say is that there are still things we can do. I've spoken a little bit about them this evening on national and international levels, and that we must continue to do those things. We as they say, must not comply in advance. We must not obey in advance. We must stand for what we stand for and continue to do so. But the place that's going to do us the most good is concentrating our efforts on our local areas, making sure that we are strong where we sit, making sure that our institutions are as strong as we can make them, making sure our communities are as strong as we can make them, bringing our people together in as much as we can, those who wish to, and establishing community resources that will help us in the difficulties we may be in the process of facing. That is my message for this evening. I think that it's a very important thing for us to focus on, and that it's very easy to just sit back and say, oh, this isn't going to happen. Oh, we don't need to worry about it. We've been saying that for many years. It's happening. It's here. We do need to worry about it, and we need to take those actions that come into our hands to take. Now, the people watching this Congress, the people taking part in this Congress, come from many different backgrounds. They have many common issues, but they're not always the same common issues for every individual, and neither will the common actions that may come from these be the same for every individual. I've talked about a number of possibilities tonight. Other people are talking about other possibilities. These are all good possibilities. There is no, you must do this involved here. Rather, these are things we can do that may improve our situation. But the one thing that won't improve our situation is doing nothing. So if you take anything away from this event, I hope that what you will take away is the need to identify your common issues with others and then to find common actions, whatever they may be, but not to simply ignore the way the world is going. All too often, we act like stereotypical ostriches and bury our heads in the sand. This is not the moment for that. And the future can certainly be affected by our actions, but we have to take them. So I ask you to find your actions and take them. And with that, I thank you for listening. I hope that you have found some things to think about in what I've had to say. And our next presentation will be at the top of the next hour. It will be the Crystal Web Ritual. I hope that you will join us for that. And again, thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoy.